Hi there, I'm Jim Bradley. I write a blog called Under the Castor Oil Tree. And today I'm going to share a couple of pieces from a manuscript that I wrote about parish ministry called Farther Along. And I often wrote about people that I served. And so I've got two of those to share with you today. It's so long, I'll only do I'll only do two today. The first one is called Little Saint Jason. Excuse me. When I was at St. Paul's in New Haven, one of my neighbors stopped me on the street and asked, "Do you do baptisms?" She and her husband lived in a handsome brownstone on the park. They were a Yale couple. She was vice president of something, and he was a professor of economics. They were the ultimate yuppies, a term that still meant something in the 1980s. She was tall, immaculately dressed for success, and quite beautiful, blonde and willowy. But she wore her hair pulled back severely and horn-rimmed glasses she may or may not have needed. I met several women who worked at big jobs at Yale who wore clear, unflattering glasses. Uh, One actually told me it was to tell people I may be pretty, but I'm smart. She was wearing a pale gray pinstripe suit, pink blouse buttoned to the neck, with one of those floppy little ties that uh, are bow ties on estrogen. But her shoes, I remember noticing, were extremely high heels with almost no visible means of keeping them on her feet. I had allowed that I allowed to her that I had been known to do baptisms from time to time, and she invited me to come around to our house for a drink, 5:30 or so. I was fascinated. I knew Donna and her husband Phil from the park. Our daughter was about their son's age, 5 maybe, and sometimes they chased each other around the park while everyone around Worcester Square let their dogs off lead to run and poop. But I'd never been invited to their house before. When we settled in with our drinks, Scotch for Phil, Manhattan for Donna, and white wine for me, I was offered hors d'oeuvres that more exotic than either of them would have been able or had time to make before my arrival. And we did Worcester Square talk. Phil, even taller than Donna and really good looking, was a New Haven clone of Mr. Chips, casually elegant in tweed, and yet a little awkward all the same. He obviously needed his glasses. In fact, he had two pair with those bands to hold them like long necklaces around your neck, one for distance and one for reading, I imagined, wondering if it were vanity or drama that prevented him from just getting bifocals. But then I'm always hard on people who come from money. Their house made no secret of that. Perhaps both of them came from money. Everything was understated but expensive, from the rugs to the lamps to the properly worn leather couch and the chairs to the antique table I set my glass on and then picked up in horror and looked around for a coaster. "Go ahead and set it there," Donna said. "It was my grandfather's, so it's really old." The people who come from real money are casual about such things. Those who got rich on their own are much less relaxed about glass rings on their table worth thousands. After some small talk about the weather, a pleasant September, better than last year, and the neighborhood. "Did you know the Masons are moving to Europe? Mark's doing a postdoctorate in France." We finally got down to business. We don't come to church, Phil began, showing his humility. But we are Episcopalians. We were married at the cathedral in Chicago. And both our parents are serious Episcopalians. And they're coming out for Thanksgiving. Little Jason hadn't been baptized. Our fault, Donna said, as if it could have been Jason's fault or the fault of Sarah, their AKC standard poodle. And there was going to be hell to pay when Grandpop and Grandma and Granny and Gramps came on Turkey Day. Before they began to grovel, which they would have, I told them I'd be delighted to baptize Jason, which I was. And we started talking about dates and times, settling on the Sunday after Thanksgiving when the grandparents on both sides would be there. I asked them to do what I wanted them to do, which was come to church a few times so they'd be familiar with the racially and socially diverse parish of St. Paul's, and let me talk with them and Jason about baptism for a few hours. They were overjoyed, calling Jason down with his nanny, a 20-something au pair from France, who was teaching Jason French as well as looking after him and taking some classes at Yale on their dime. I thought I had maybe underestimated the money they came from. I knew Jason, of course, and he knew me as Mimi's dad. And we talked briefly about coming to church and talking about baptism. Later, Mom and Dad and Jason spent several hours with me. Phil, of course, and Donna, only to a slightly lesser degree, knew the ins and outs of liturgy and church history and the rich myriad of symbols that made up baptism. Jason asked some of those classic kids' questions. Will the water be hot or cold? Will I have to say anything? Will Jesus be there? I told them at some point that baptism, to my theology, was admission to communion, and Jason could receive communion with them on his baptismal day. Donna was a bit horrified. But he isn't old enough to understand it, she said. I thought for a minute and replied, if understanding is a prerequisite, then I shouldn't receive it either. It was a hard sell, but Jason won the day. I want to, Mommy, he said, and Donna, and the deal was done. True to the word, Donna, Phil, and Jason became fixtures in the third row near the pulpit. From time to time, Bridget would come with them, and all of them fit in just fine, a little better dressed than most, but open and friendly and involved. During that time, I came once more face to face with my devotion to F. Scott Fitzgerald's observation that the rich are not like you and me. I've never quite felt comfortable around the moneyed of the world. Certainly both a character flaw and a disadvantage for rapid advancement in the Episcopal Church. Donna and Phil were just like me. We had many of the same interests and opinions, and Jason was just a kid, dressed in clothes from Barney's instead of Sears. I came to like them a lot, which prepared me to like their parents as well. Jason's two grandfathers were cut from the same mold, successful, keen, and most likely ruthless Midwesterners, businessmen who nevertheless possessed the shy, inviting charm of people from the center of the country. The grandmothers were different. Donna's mom was an older version of her, stylish, lovely, cultured. But Phil's mother was like someone Garrison Keillor would make up and put in Wale Woebegone. She was a tad overweight, with a broad, smiling face, gray hair in a bun, and simple clothing. She would have been very comfortable in an apron wandering around the house. They were all delighted that Jason, his paternal grandmother put it, was finally getting dumped. And on the day of the baptism, they were all radiant and joyful. The baptism went fine. Jason answered loudly when I asked him if he desired to be baptized, and stepped up on the little stool I dug out to lean his head over the font with perfect grace. But the real grace came when the family, led by Jason, came up to receive communion. Jason received the wafer and carefully, precisely dipped it halfway down into the wine before consuming it. Then he said thank you to the chalices and started back to his seat between the lines of people waiting for the rail. He stopped beside the first person he passed and said politely, I just got the excuse me, I just got the body of Christ. That person nodded slightly, but tried to remain solemn, just the way we should be on the way to the greatest party ever thrown. So Jason was a little louder with the next person and louder still with the one after that. By then, the lack of response began to confuse and annoy him. And he started pulling his pants legs and skirts. I just got the body of Christ, he said to every person he passed. Donna's father got to him first and picked him up, looking back embarrassingly at me. Jason was trying to get free from his grandfather's embrace. There were lots more people to tell about what had just happened. I stopped the service right there, asking the organist to stop playing, and pointed to Jason in the arms of his grandfather. Do you hear what he's telling you? I said softly. Can you begin to understand what waits up here for you? Jason understands, and he's telling you to run to this table because the mystery and wonder here is more than you can imagine, more than you can imagine. For months after that, I was told people going back from communion would lean over and whisper to their friends, guess what I just got? And for a while, the spirit of Jason's understanding astonished us all. I had wondered if having Jason dunked would be the end of the family's church going. I wouldn't have been upset if it had, since the sacrament was valid and real and objective. But they kept coming for a few months until Donna was offered a position at the president's office of Northwestern, and Phil was asked to teach at the University of Chicago. The jobs were so good they were leaving at the end of the first semester. I was sad to see them go, but it gave me a little rush to think that someone had used Yale as a stepping stone to what they really wanted. I went down the day they moved and watched the movers carefully empty the house of beautiful, viable things. Donna, so unlike her, was dressed in faded jeans and one of Phil's J. Crew white shirts. Her hair was a mess and she had on neither makeup nor glasses. She hugged me and told me I could find Phil and Jason and the dog and the nanny over in the park. Before I went to say goodbye to them, she said, did we tell you that Jason's favorite game now is playing priest? He baptizes G.I. Joe daily and gives communion ever so often. He wears one of Phil's t-shirts and puts one of his ties around his neck. It's really very sweet, she said. It was sweet, but she looked worried. It's just a phase, I said, like me. You're in a phase, she said, smiling. Yeah, I said, but mine came late and stayed for a while. Then I went to see my friends and say goodbye. This next one is called Butterfly. Butterfly, God bless it. I've changed the names of people up to now, but there's no way to do that with Butterfly. I considered calling him Moth or Bumblebee or Hummingbird, but none of those or any other would do justice to what and who he was. He was Butterfly, I'll change his real name to Michael Caruso from what it was. But that, or his real name, does not do him justice. He was Butterfly. He signed his artwork Papillion, which was a misspelling of the French for butterfly. So even he couldn't come up with a name that worked beside the one he was, Butterfly. He was 6 feet 6 inches tall and probably weighed 150 pounds, 10 pounds of which was the jewelry he wore around his neck and in his ears. He told me he had a total of 27 earrings, 13 on the right ear and 14 on the left. I never counted. I simply took his word for it. And most of the earrings were of, you guessed it, butterflies. He also wore dozens of rings and bracelets on each arm and a ring on every finger of both hands. And he had so much jewelry with butterflies on it. I don't know where he bought it, on eBay, or he had neither computer or money. But over the years of his life, he had found all this stuff and covered himself with it. There's a scene in a novel by George MacDonald, a writer who was friends with C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, where a character is completely enveloped by a flock of monarch butterflies. Every inch of his body is, for a moment or two, covered with butterflies. I'm sorry I never found that passage and shared it with Papillion that I knew. He would have danced around the room, all arms and legs and jewelry, with delight and wonder just reading about an event like that. He was Butterfly. He was long he was long since a character around downtown Waterbury before I arrived. Eccentric doesn't do the job in describing him. Neither does odd, oddball, unconventional, unusual, peculiar, strange, or weird, which were synonyms my computer thesaurus gave me for eccentric. I won't even bother going into the Roget's. Every word there will apply but not describe. He usually wore a mohawk, which revealed a huge gash in the back of his head. Where'd you get that scar, Butterfly? I asked. When I was in prison, I sort of started a riot, he said. Where were you in prison? California. California, there I was, till I got arrested by the thugs. He danced around my office where we were talking. What were you in prison for? Weed, reefer, possession of the devil's workshop. He showed me how to inhale and hold it while offering me an imaginary joint. The ones he had earlier weren't imaginary. I could smell it across the room. That's an idle mind, I told him. What is? The idle mind is a devil's workshop. I had one of them too, he said, moving again. He was hopelessly ADD. He couldn't sit still for a minute. It was in the 60s, man. How long did you serve? I asked. 8 years. I was astonished. 8 years for possession of marijuana in California in the 60s? Everyone would have been in prison. Butterfly smiled at me and shook his head. I possessed 50 acres, he said. And he was as flamboyantly homosexual as anyone I ever met. Gay and lesbian folks I knew gave him wide berth. He wore skin-tight clothes, his shirt open to the navel, so you can see my jewelry, he told me when I asked him why he didn't button his shirt up at least a little, and always had glitter all over his face and chest. He wore lots of eyeliner and mascara, but drew the line at lipstick. Only faggots wear lipstick, he's told me once, letting me in on his makeup philosophy. And I'm not a faggot. I'm a goddamn screaming queer. Did I leave out the tattoos? Dozens and dozens of tattoos on every part of the body you could see. And during the summer, when he wore short shorts, there were lots of skin to see. Most all of them were, you probably guessed, butterflies. When I asked him why he became butterfly, he grew serious for one of the few times I knew him and started talking in a soft, almost dreamy voice, like his unusually rapid staccato, unlike his usually rapid staccato falsetto. When I was a boy, he told me, I knew something was wrong with me. Everyone said it when they thought I couldn't hear them. I was strange and freakish. Something was wrong. I didn't do well in school and didn't have any friends. I used to wonder what I'd rather be than me. Then one day I watched a butterfly out in the yard for about an hour. It didn't go in a straight line. It was so beautiful. It could flit and it could soar. And a while it came and landed on my face. And its little feet were sticky and so tiny, like eyelashes. I was in love. I sat in his silence, fascinated and not a little moved by his story. And after a few minutes, he leaped up from the couch where he was sitting and started dancing around my office. It's the flitting part that I like. A remarkable thing was how many people were genuinely fond of butterfly. There was something childlike below the weirdness, something playful and touching and inviting. The two women who ran the council of churches, a tough old swamp Yankee and the sweet rural wife of an American Baptist minister in town, both adored him. And so and did and so did the nun, street smart and savvy, who was the director of the Social Service Administration. The oddest couples of his relationship was with Allie, a conservative Republican in her early 30s, who was a member of the American Rifle Association and carried a little snub-nosed 38 in her purse all the time. Allie and Butterfly were always talking after church, and one day when Allie had told me she was pregnant, Butterfly came running up to me with her in tow. He embraced her. She was short and her head barely reached his nipples, which of course you could see because his shirt was open. Allie's got a bun in the oven, he announced loudly, and I'm going to be the fairy godmother. They looked at each other with genuine devotion, and then she pressed her face against his blade. It's not that Butterfly wasn't a problem. He was stoned entirely too much and so promiscuous that it made my eyes ache. I actually feared for him because he'd take about any man he found home. And he had a temper. His primary adversary was Justine, the local shopping cart lady who hung out at most of the downtown churches the way Butterfly did. She was a whole story in herself, but they were like the proverbial oil and water. I'd turned them both off the property for a day or two with regularity. They couldn't be near each other without fighting about something. Once during a Tuesday morning Eucharist with my clericus crew, I heard them out in the hall screaming like banshees at each other with remarkable combinations of profanity. I was halfway through the prayer of consecration, but the din was so disturbing I thought one of them might kill the other. To tell the truth, at that moment, I wished they were the gingham dog and calico cat and would simply tear each other to shreds. I took off the stole I was wearing, dropped it around one of the other priests' neck, and went to scold the children. I was on them with like stink, well, you know on what. I got between them and screamed them into silence. Why has God sent the two of you to me? I yelled. They looked at me like I was an alien from a distant galaxy. Then I banished them from the building for 2 days and went back to receive the sacrament I had only half blessed. But the real story, the story that intrigues, delights, and haunts me to this day, was Butterfly and Millicent. Millicent was an elderly woman who lived in one of the less fancy rest homes that any city the size of whatever he has. We somehow, as a culture, have warehoused the elderly to keep them safe from others and themselves. Some homes do it with a minimum of grace and care, in spite of the crushing numbers and limited resources, but most don't. Millicent's rest home was in the latter category. Once I met her, I visited her with some regularity, especially after Butterfly's murder, and it was Butterfly who introduced us. I pulled into the parking lot and noticed that Butterfly and an elderly woman who was dressed rather stylishly, 1950s stylishly, but stylishly nevertheless, were standing on the street near the entrance to the parking lot. I got out of my car and went to say hello. Butterfly was puffing as hard as he could on a joint, while Millicent waited for him to finish toking up. Butterfly, always the gentleman, said, holding his breath, Millicent, this is Father Jim. Jim, this is Millicent Randolph. That was quite a feat to say on an inhale, and Millicent and I shook hands. Butterfly has told me all about you, she said in an accent that hinted at Back Bay, Boston. He's taking me to the AA meeting in your church this morning. I turned and saw Butterfly knock the ash off his joint and eat what was left. You're going to an AA meeting? I asked him with as much judgment as I could muster. He swallowed and smiled. It's Alcoholics Anonymous, he said, taking Millicent's thin arm and leading her a bit unstably toward the church. Millicent was actually an aristocrat of sorts, not from Boston, but from Manhattan. Though she'd gone to school at Vassar and picked up a Boston accent and a Boston Brahmin to boot. They lived in Greenwich, summered on Nantucket, and had a little place in Miami Beach. But one of their perfect three children was murdered while attending Columbia. He was 19, and Millicent fell completely, totally, absolutely apart. By the time her therapy and taste for scotch and her profound depression began to lift, even a bit, her husband had divorced her. Her daughters given up on her. Her friends abandoned her, and her own family disowned her. She finally encountered her higher power in the basement of an Episcopal church somewhere southwest Connecticut and dragged herself back to who she had been, though stronger, she told me. But by then her body had betrayed her as well. And having used up all her own money, she ended up through a social worker at a rehab center in Fairfield County in the rest home in Waterbury. I was in a fog, she told me, long after that meeting at West Main Street, while Butterfly fortified himself for the AA meeting. It lasted almost 15 years. Her son had been one of the Oops children when she was 36, and her daughters were 11 and 9. So the fog set in when she was 54 and didn't lift until she was 69, going on 85, penniless, forsaken, extremely ill. How did you meet Butterfly? I asked her shortly after meeting with her. She was sitting in the church waiting for Butterfly to smoke some dope before walking her the 3 blocks back home. She smiled and looked her age, or a decade older. He volunteers at the home, she told me. He picks up people's prescriptions from the drugstore and gets folks some fast food when they want it and brings around newspapers each morning. I shook my head. Like a diamond, Butterfly has many facets. She took a deep breath. This church is very beautiful, she said. Butterfly told me to ask you if you'd do my funeral here when the time comes. I nodded and mumbled, of course. She continued, he wants to be buried from here too, he told me. Don't forget, since I doubt he's told me, you. I nodded more that I wouldn't forget. But then in the end, I, after all, had to scramble hard to keep my promise. Butterfly and Millicent were became a team. He beginning to bring her to church. She'd grown up in high church on St. Thomas in New York and had to get used to our less formal ways. She was always had something insightful to say about the sermon, and Butterfly, flitting around, unable to sit still, would make sure he was there to help her up to communion. She became a den mother of a quiet, unruly AA meeting. Most of the people who came were court ordered and just wanted their papers signed, but she adopted them all, having only dad and the strange children of her own, and kept a discipline and ensured that the crowd noise at the break was a minimum. And Butterfly saw to every need and every whim. Though Millicent didn't have many whims anymore. She was down to needs and nothing else. One day, the week before he was murdered, Butterfly simply opened the door to my office and came in. I was with a woman who believed her child was on drugs and her husband was having an affair. I was looking through my Rolodex to find a number of psychologists and a drug hotline for her to call. I had been present to her pain, but she needed a real professional. She was sitting on the couch wiping her eyes. Butterfly butted in, waving a piece of paper and shouting, I passed, I don't have AIDS. The woman jumped up and looked horrified at such a creature that intruded on her pain and suffering with such a message. Butterfly didn't work for the uninitiated. His charm was an acquired taste. I threw him unceremoniously out of my office and told him to wait on me in the library downstairs. He turned just like a 10-year-old showing you their report card and being rejected. He shut the door softly behind him, and I started writing phone numbers on the back of my calling card. I was furious with him. I went down to the library and I yelled at him, screamed at him. He was working on one of his artworks. What he did was trace characters like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, and then surround them with leaves and flowers and rainbows and stars, and color them with crayons and stick them to a piece of cardboard. He always signed them Papilio and gave them to people if they were as if they were Picassos or Rembrandts, which in the last analysis they were. I'm looking at the one he did for me, my wife, as I write this. I keep it near the desk where I work. Her name, Byrne, is outlined in green, colored yellow, and two little balloons in the B are hearts colored red. Practically everyone I knew in those days had a Papillion original, and most people kept them inside. But I wasn't thinking of that the last afternoon I saw him. I was thinking of how inappropriate and intrusive he had been, and how he had crossed the line and shattered a boundary, how he had fucked up big time. Aren't you happy I don't have AIDS? He asked me, as if nothing had happened 15 minutes before, as innocent as a child, which was the truth. I'm very happy for you, I said, trying not to let my anger show. And for me, since I have you around to drive me crazy for a long time. He laughed at that, but I continued doing my lamentation duty as the authority in his life, trying to do what was best for him, trying to teach him a lesson. He was about to burst into tears, and sometimes he did. But when he wiped his face with his forearm, he was reminded that he was wearing a black leather jacket, some sizes too large. Then he smiled and got up, coming over to show me the jacket. It's my new boyfriend's, he told me. Isn't it delicious? Where'd you meet this new boyfriend? I asked, touching the leather. It was delicious. I wished I had one. Library Park, he said, dancing away, his head leaned back, a child with a new crush. He's from Brooklyn, just got in town last night. I got the test for him. He's really fabulous. He's really big, I said, looking at the jacket. Oh, I'll find that out tonight, Butterfly said, moving toward the door. swishing as hard as a skinny 6'6" man could swish. I'll let you know. Then he stopped and counted his fingers. This is Tuesday, he said. 4 days will be Sunday. See you then. Be careful, Butterfly, I called after him. But I don't think he heard me. And I didn't see him on Sunday because Saturday night at some time, his new boyfriend stabbed him to death. With a large pair of scissors, Butterfly had to cut the cardboard so he could stick his glue art to it. And Sunday was Palm Sunday, the first day of the octave that includes Holy Week and Easter, and the holiest week of the Christian year. A police officer who knew Butterfly, didn't they all, came by the church about 9 a.m. after the early service to tell me that Butterfly had been murdered and the murderer was in custody. I found words in spite of my shock and horror and gathered shame about my last encounter with him. Why did he kill him, do you know? The police officer looked back through his little notebook. One of the detectives told me it had something to do with Butterfly wearing his leather jacket without asking. There's a little more to that, but I've gone so long, I think I'll stop. Maybe I'll share the ending with you next week. And I hope to see you next week. And you can find my blog on Blogspot. It's under the Castor Oil Tree. I'm Jim Bradley. It's been a joy being with you. And I hope you're well and happy and safe. Be well and stay well, my friends. Goodbye.